Why would a member of the Justice Department be contacting a newspaper editor to complain about Jim Bovard? Join Richard Ebeling and me and James Bovard as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show that y'all know brings you the principal case for the libertarian philosophy, the free society, free markets, limited government, exposing the false and failures and fallacies of the omnipotent state. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, and we have the good fortune and the honor and the pleasure of having Jim Bovard back as a guest of Libertarian Angle. Welcome to you, Jim, and welcome to you, Richard.
Thanks a lot, Jacob. Thanks, Richard. Good to be with you guys. Always good to have you guys giving me an antidote for my moderate tendencies.
Well, it's always good to have you here, Jim, because you bring a sense of humor and a sense of perspective on what's going on in the world that I think everybody should pay attention to. But one of the things that really caught my attention, I mean, I love all your articles, especially the ones you write for Future of Freedom Foundation, of course.
Thanks.
But the one that Jim's been writing for us for, 30 years or so, Jim.
Yeah,
and
94.
Yeah, but the one that got my attention, though, was the one that you wrote recently about the Justice Department writing an email or a series of emails to USA Today, where you serve on the board of, I forget what it's called.
Contributors.
Board of contributors there at USA Today. And here is the Justice Department writing them regarding you. Can you tell us a little bit about what went on there, the background of it, and what actually happened?
Yeah, this is, I've done several articles for USA Today beating up on Eric Holder, Attorney General. And Holder was, the media gave him a halo, but he had a very bad record, as he was U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia before he became a top official in the Clinton administration, and then later Attorney General for Obama. But when he was U.S. Attorney for D.C., he had jurisdiction over the police shooting cases. And, Eric Holder basically never saw a police shooting that he didn't like as far as the District of Columbia. There were a lot of outrageous cases that he chose not to prosecute. And then flash forward to 2014, you have the shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Holder is portraying himself as a champion of investigating the police, making them obey the law and stuff like that. It was hokum. And then Holder announced he was resigning in early 2015. So I wrote a story about his lawless legacy. He was a champion of Obama's drone assassination program, in which the president claimed that he had the authority on his own to order the assassination of American citizens who he labeled terrorist suspects. Eric Holder gave a great speech on this. He was I've forgotten where it was, but he was saying, well, you got to keep in mind that due process doesn't necessarily mean in courts. It's just a process that you do. So, some of the late night comics had fun with that. But so I was smacking him around. And so the press chief for Justice Department sent several messages to my editors at USA Today in 2015 complaining about my consistently nasty words about Mr. Holder. And he's never had a kind thing to say about him. And he said that I've authored pieces in various places criticizing Holder and civil liberties, civil asset forfeiture, media subpoenas. In the past, Bovard even has articulated a conspiracy theory involving Mr. Holder and the incident at Waco in the 1990s. Oh, the incident. Is that what that was? It was an incident. 80 dead bodies after the FBI used pyrotechnic explosive devices. Yeah, it was just an incident. And so this guy says, I don't understand why USA Today would provide a platform on repeated occasion for Bovard's Holder bashing. my editor there, David Mastio, sent a note back. He said, I can guarantee you that I return phone calls and emails from the Attorney General's representatives a hell of a lot faster than aging libertarians. Now, this aging libertarians, it has no relevance to you or Richard, but I mean, maybe there's a few folks out there in the audience who hear the phrase aging libertarians and they just have that flashback to Rodney Dangerfield. Don't get no respect.
All right. Well, this happened back in 2015. So when did you learn about these emails and how did you come to learn about them?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I said it was a good question. What else? What else do you want to know? I said, I've praised your quick penetration of the issue, Bumper.
Okay.
But
So
these are emails which I received through the Freedom of Information Act. I had to file 2 separate requests, but they finally said, "Oh, those emails." So. And then they were posted in the article originally for Scott Horton at Libertarian Institute. Then it got picked up by Counterpunch, and then the Washington Times wrote about it.
And when was this? When did you get the Freedom of Information response that included the emails?
It was, I think, maybe in 2020.
So this is 5 years after the fact, then.
Yeah. Well, part of what made me wonder is I wonder what else that the Justice Department or FBI or other places may have done to kind of put a throttle on some of my outlets, because I've been publicly attacked by the chiefs of 12 federal agencies and cabinet departments, including the chief of the FBI, Louis Freeh, was attacking my articles on Ruby Ridge. I don't know what impact that may have had on some editors. I know there are lots of editors who spend a lot of time groveling to the FBI, hoping to get a leak, hoping to get some inside information, or just trying to stand in the reflection of the halo. So,
well, that's the point I wanted to make here, is that this is absolutely an incredible abuse of power, that everybody knows the power of the federal government. And I love it when federal officials say, go and preach to the Russians and the Chinese about how we in America have freedom of speech. Well, certainly freedom of speech is guaranteed in the First Amendment, but that doesn't mean that it's being honored. And when you see something like this, when this guy writes that kind of email, he knows that he is writing with the full force of the Justice Department and the federal government behind him. And it takes a lot for an editor to not pay attention. It's like what this editor says, man, I'm going to return their phone calls and respond to their emails immediately. And so it serves as a suppressant. You don't have to have a formal law that says get rid of Jim Bovard, but the message is clear. I don't like what this guy is printing. If you know what's good for you, you will stop publishing him. And it's impossible to know how much of this is going on across the country, where deputy attorney generals are making calls like this. Editors are not going to reveal it, obviously. You had to go through a Freedom of Information Act to get it. And not only that, but by this time, every editor and every publisher knows what the accepted parameters are, at least in most areas, like what the Pentagon wants them to say, what the CIA wants them to say. So even if a phone call isn't made, they know that if they're going to not displease the political powers, they're going to operate within this realm. What you've done is just gone behind the curtain and exposed something that most of us don't ever see.
Well, and thanks, Bumper. The thing that I'd love to know is how often this happens. How many other times has it happened, and how many editors might have been influenced by these kind of messages? I mean, I was a little surprised that they put this in writing. I mean, often this is the kind of thing that would, if a government official would come up to an editor at a reception and say, "Oh, by the way, But you know, I think back to 1993 and 94. Trying to sell articles on what happened at Waco was very, very difficult. Same for Ruby Ridge. Eventually, some doors opened. David Brooks, who was then editorial features editor at Wall Street Journal, was great on that, but that was rare. Same with Mary Lou Forbes at Washington Times, but you know, that's a short list. And certainly you at Future Freedom Foundation, which I appreciated. But by and large, I mean, a lot of these editors are folks don't get in these jobs basically from raising hell. But there's been a huge change in journalism in general, and it's become more risk averse. And it's also become more deferential to the government. At the same time, the government is doing a hell of a lot more mischief to subvert our rights and liberties. If you look at the type of crusades the media has done in the last 5 years, they had endless stories about Russiagate and Trump as a Russian agent, which basically collapsed like a souffle. But at the same time, they've ignored the string pulling by a lot of folks in the government and elsewhere in Washington to drag the U.S. into foreign conflicts. And it's like, I can understand why folks are very skeptical of the media these days.
Well, let me just say one more thing before I pull Richard into this, that, you know, when I read one of Robert Caro's volumes on Lyndon Johnson, I remember that there was a section in there where after Johnson became president, there had been extensive investigations into his criminal conduct, Billy Saul Estes and other scandals, and Johnson was perilously close to getting indicted and removed from office. And he, right after he gets to be president, he telephones two editors of two different papers in Texas, and he tells one, "You get that guy off that story, that investigative story of me, if you know what's good for you with respect to the IRS."
Wow.
And
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it worked. That guy squelched that investigator. They shut him down. The other one, Johnson said, if you know what's good for you with respect to the merger that you're trying to get through the federal government, get it approved, you can kiss that goodbye unless you shut down this investigation. The guy shut down the investigation.
Wow,
so
I didn't know that.
I mean, people understand, or people should understand, the great power of the federal government. When a deputy attorney general writes an email or calls, he's got the full force of the federal government behind him. It's the rare person that can stand up against that. And they know what they're doing when they do this. When I was a lawyer, before I came into the libertarian movement in Dallas, I was representing a woman who was the wife of the head of the Federal Savings and Loan Department there in Dallas. And they were indicting her because they were claiming that she had received a bribe, and this was during the FSLIC controversy, or that she had received some kind of benefit or something. And after taking her deposition, the deputy U.S. attorney comes over to me and says, "I'd be real careful if I were you."
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, I said, "What are you talking about?" "I just would be real careful." What he's really saying is, if you represent this woman and continue to represent her hard, we may come after you. I mean, that's the kind of thing they do with their intimidation tactics.
Wow.
And so it's really good that you're exposing this, Jim. It's just fantastic.
I'm trying. But take a quick step back. David Mascio, the editor who I mentioned earlier, was excellent dealing with on the FBI. I did a number of stories for him afterwards on the TSA and FBI, and he was very good on those issues. He's no longer with USA Today. So,
okay, Richard.
Well, I'll just sort of add, many people think that if, as you were saying, Jacob, if something is in the Constitution, then it must be secure and guaranteed. But what's on a piece of paper is cheap, unless there's a spirit of believing in the principle behind those words and the institutions to bolster and support it. For example, in the 1930s, during the American Great Depression, many people hailed one of the Soviet constitutions that had been promulgated under Stalin that here all the Western civil liberties are guaranteed, and even more in terms of redistributive social justice things. And see, they're as free as us, and it's on paper. Well, of course, that was a mockery. What's on paper was not assured. Certainly, a Marxist ideology did not believe in the respect for individuals and their rights. And institutionally, there was nothing separating the state from all aspects of the society. The only variation in our situation is that nominally private property is supposed to be secured in various and sundry ways. But when the state has so much power and has such a degree of arrogance to presume that it can indirectly act in an undermining way towards liberty and property. What do I mean by undermining way? What you experienced, Jacob. You know, the judicial system is supposed to be independent and autonomous. Everyone is supposed to be able to have the best defense possible in the case of an attorney, and the law is supposed to be guided by a lady of justice that is blind. But someone comes up and says you ought to watch, you know, what you're doing and who you defend. And the use of implicit regulatory and fiscal powers to say, well, you know, if you don't stop publishing or rein in this editorial writer, well, you know, there are regulatory ways to see if you're acting properly under the regulatory procedures, or, you know, maybe unexpectedly you might come up for an IRS audit, and God knows what that leads to. These are all ways in which government has the ability to make people subservient and quiet and obedient, and staying within a narrow corridor of acceptable views and values and policy perspectives without being so as heavy-handed as arresting you and throwing you into a gulag. One of the worst forms of censorship is the self-censorship that comes through intimidation from one person being set up as an example by the state in some way, and everybody knowing then it could happen to them. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans think that we are much freer than in fact we really are, and that we're more secure in our constitutional rights than is actually the case.
I agree. Excellent points. And it's frustrating to deal with people sometimes who simply are not willing to recognize the, as you said, all these different levers of power and intimidation, and how the playing field is tilted. And, you know, on top of that, you have the, you know, you got politicians out there attacking people for, you know, hate speech if they use for one new pretext after another, and most of it's completely bogus. But there's a lot of vilifying going on, and there's this, you know, there's a fundamental problem of a lack of gumption. I mean, I think back to the 80s and 1990s, you know, there were more editors, newspaper editors then, who enjoyed raising hell, and you know, whereas now, I mean, part of the reason people aren't reading newspapers is because the newspapers have become risk averse as far as stirring controversy, except when it's for a lot of idiot causes that, you know, simply drive readers further away. So, not that I'm bitter.
No, I think a reason for that is that they know what their parameters are. I mean, everybody assumes that Operation Mockingbird disappeared when they exposed it, but I don't think it did, and I don't think the CIA needs to necessarily be recruiting people in the newspapers. I think it's sort of a self-induced thing where a lot of these people grow up, especially in the post 9/11 era, thinking that they need to be supporting the CIA, just like the Cold War mentality. When so many journalists would self-designate, oh, I want to be an asset of the CIA, I want to report to them what I'm seeing, and I think that's what's been going on for the last 20 years, is that the newspaper business has gotten boring as far as the regular public is concerned. They don't have any trust in them, but as far as the national security establishment goes, they're as pleased as punch because they don't get anybody questioning their forever wars. Oh yeah, they'll question what Russia's doing, but in the process, they never question what the U.S. government is doing, even when what it's doing is exactly what the Russian regime is doing. So it's sort of a self-induced censorship in a way, it seems to me.
Well, it's an our team censorship. And I mean, I see that so often with U.S. foreign policy. I mean, Biden goes over to the Middle East, and there's almost nothing about the ravages that U.S. has caused in Syria, a tiny bit about Yemen, but instead the media focuses on a stupid fist bump. It's like,
Yeah. All right, well, let's shift gears a bit. And what have you been writing about lately? You been writing anything about the Fed, the inflation problem going on?
I had a story, I guess, yesterday in New York Post talking about Biden and his new definition of recession, the Team Biden, and they were talking about how the standard for economists has been 2 quarters in a row where the economy contracts. That's a recession. Biden's people now are talking about it like it's an arcane metaphysical dispute. Instead, we need holistic data. And so if you look at the curve and this curve and that curve in the labor market versus this, then maybe if we jiggle this a little bit. So the Biden people are trying to find a way that there is no recession until the day after the midterm elections. After the midterm elections, you can have a recession, but not until then. But so I had some fun with that. I said, okay, so the Biden people are coming up with a new definition of recession. I'm waiting for them to come up with a new definition of going to hell in the handbasket.
Well, unfortunately, these things are typical of how those with ideological axis to grind or political motives constantly use language. I mean, inflation has historically been known as an increase in the quantity of money or central bank created credit that cumulatively over a certain period of time starts bringing about a general rise of prices in the economy. But now, no, you don't want to point a finger at years now of Federal Reserve mismanagement or various fiscal consequences of deficit spending that has also motivated the Fed to create huge amounts of credit in the banking system to facilitate the financing of those deficits. No, it's greedy businessmen. It's a war in Ukraine. It has to do with supply chain problems that somehow the market has caused rather than originating in and continuing to be influenced by the government's responses to the COVID crisis beginning over 2 years ago. It's always finger pointing that it's the private sector or greedy businessmen or something having to do with the weather or some external shock that is beyond your own government's and central banks' control to have any power over. And that therefore, it's like an external force that is autonomously occurring. The idea that it originates ultimately with increases in the money supply in an institutional setting in which government has monopoly control over its issuance and it's the manipulation of its value, and that the fiscal policies of the government are guiding a lot of it because the Federal Reserve, with all of its independence, is expected to accommodate the monetary needs of governments spending largesse, is just driven out of the picture.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how easy the government and the Federal Reserve get away with that. I think back to last Thanksgiving, the Federal Reserve out of I think it was St. Louis sent out a tweet and was telling people, okay, the prices have gone up, but you can save money by substituting, instead of turkey, have tofu, and you can save like 66 cents per serving. There was a professor that I think out of New York that Bloomberg circulated an op-ed of hers, and she was saying that Americans just need to be a little more responsible to find ways to save money. Sort of like, and one of the examples she gave was, killing your pets if they get sick, or letting your pets die. Well, the dog is sick. You can save a lot of money. So it's like, somebody could do a great symbol for that for the liberal inflation fighters. First, they came for the pets. So.
Well, I got to say, I'm really amused over how this whole inflationary thing has been going on. I mean, for decades now, and especially in the last 10 years, they've been spending money like there was no tomorrow, both Republicans and Democrats. And remember, every time there was a debt ceiling debate, And here at FFF, we were saying, don't raise the debt ceiling when they've already got enough debt. The mainstream press would say, you know, the Chicken Little thing, the sky will fall in if we don't raise the debt ceiling. But as soon as the debt ceiling's raised, they never call for reducing government spending to prepare for the new ceiling. It's always, well, it's just business as usual. And they just have kept spending and spending. They've got $30 trillion in debt. And it's the Federal Reserve's job. That was the purpose of the Federal Reserve, to pay off this debt, to accommodate this debt in cheap and debased dollars. That's why we've had monetary debasement, well, since 1913. That's why silver coins don't circulate anymore. And now they're in a trap, though. You see, they've had all this quantitative easing for 10 years, all this easy money. They've got prices soaring, which are really just a reflection of the debased currency. That's the only way you can reflect a devalued currency, is it makes it more expensive in the things that the money is buying. And they know an election's around the corner. They know Donald Trump is here in the wings. So if the Fed tries to tighten up, that means a boom bust recession. That means the Republicans are waiting in the wings and Donald Trump's waiting in the wings. I mean, they're kind of trapped. I suspect that the Fed's going to have to give in. I don't think they're going to be able to withstand the pressure to keep the easy money going. And so there's really the potential for that the chickens are coming home to roost here on this welfare, warfare, state spending. I think they're really trapped. I don't know where they're going to go with it.
Well, another element of all this, and taking the long view, is that every time the Fed undertakes its inescapable mismanagement of the money and banking system, and crises of one sort or another with varying degrees of severity are the result, do they ever wear sackcloth and ashes and admit that they failed and maybe they shouldn't be doing this because it's just a form of monetary central planning and we know that central planning doesn't work? No. What do they immediately say? We've learned the lessons, so to do it better next time, to prevent this type of a crisis from occurring once again. They're in a constant learning mode, the consequences of which is the same mistakes are made because it is embedded in the institutional nature of the system. You cannot have a central banking system doing anything other than what our central bank and most other banks, central banks around the world, have invariably done. And that is distort interest rates, create money out of thin air, save the political interests of their governments in terms of their respective fiscal policies, and bring about booms and busts, inflations, recessions, and the instability and destruction of people's ordinary lives.
So here's a question, Richard. I'm wondering if the employees of the Federal Reserve get automatic COLAs, get automatic salary increases for the inflation. I bet that they do.
Well, let me, you would know the answer to this, I hope, Jim. If you are, quote, a regular federal employee, that is the Department of Justice, Department of the Treasury, et cetera, agriculture, do they have COLAs in their contracts?
They had them for a long time. They might have been phased out with the fall in the rate of inflation after Reagan. But I mean, what I've seen often is I think President Biden announced a big increase for federal employees recently across the board, which really guarantees that they're going to become better workers. So I'm not sure, but that's a good question.
The reason I'm asking, Jim, is that, as I understand it, if you go to work for the Federal Reserve, you have federal social employee status, right? You're a civil servant under federal law.
Yeah.
Which shows just how independent the Federal Reserve is. But the fact is, if they do have civil service status, then I presume that any COLA that covers other branches of the federal government would cover them as well. So they're protected. They're protected in terms of CPI increases.
Yeah, it's interesting how they think of themselves. I was on a hike a few years ago and talking to this young guy who was a Federal Reserve economist, and he was full of bluster and all this stuff. And I said, you know, I have the impression that the Federal Reserve is biased as far as what it does with asset values. And he said that wasn't true at all, because him and most of the other people who he knew who worked there simply put their money into stock index funds, which means that they aren't biased. And I'm thinking, oh, okay.
Well, one other point that I want to emphasize, both of you have alluded to this, but Richard especially, is this is such a sophisticated racket, and they've gotten away with it for decades, because the average person really has no idea that it's the Federal Reserve that's doing all this. You see gasoline prices soaring, grocery store prices soaring, healthcare costs soaring. And the beauty of the system from the standpoint of federal officials is the average person thinks, oh, well, the federal government needs to do something to fight this. And I'm reminded of the whip inflation now buttons that under the Ford administration. Like, we've all got to rally together to fight this external enemy, like it was a virus that just sort of kind of hits the United States, or it's the greedy service station owner, or the greedy profiteers that are raising their prices, or COVID, or the Russians. Remember, the Russians are also being blamed for
price type. Yeah. Yeah, there's, it's interesting. John Maynard Keynes had a wonderful line about inflation. He said that the government destroys the currency in a way that not one person in 1,000 can recognize. But I wonder if that's changed, because Biden gave a speech to the Democratic members of Congress at a retreat earlier this year, and Biden started screaming into the microphone that inflation was not because of government money printing. And so if Biden has to scream it, then maybe enough people are catching on to that particular lie. So maybe there's hope. Well, not much.
Well, the thing is that at the end of the day, when inflation has continued long enough and is increasingly severe, that is accelerating in terms of its weekly and its monthly percentage increases as measured by some index. What are people's responses to this? They finally understand who is behind it and what is going on. And what do? They don't continue to complain about the local grocer. What they start doing is, whether the law permits it or not, substitute into what they view as more stable and secure alternative currencies. It could be gold and silver, jewels, or just using another currency that's circulating in the world that, compared to theirs, is more stable. Back in the late 1980s, I was on a lecture tour through Brazil when they were going through a hyperinflation, which is usually defined by macroeconomists as prices in general rising at 50% or more per month. So they were going through this hyperinflation. And in spite of the fact that the official government currency, which had legal status, was known as the Cruzado, I was finding out by talking to people at all areas and spectrums of the society that they were increasingly refusing to accept their own national currency in everyday transactions, and instead choosing to use dollars. So Brazil would export goods, they would earn hard currency like dollars, but rather than turn around and spend those dollars on some foreign good, which is quite often the case, they were just importing those earned dollars and using it as an alternative currency, because in their eyes, the dollar was far more stable than anything their own currency was reflecting and likely to become. And so people finally get wise that it is the government's own money that is behind this, and they start using an alternative that they choose, whether the government likes it or permits it legally.
Yeah, and I think it's important to bring up the founding system of this country. I mean, the framers knew, our ancestors knew when they founded this country, of the dangers of inflation. That's why there was no central bank, and for another 100 years to 1913. And they used gold and silver coins as the official money. It wasn't any paper money. It was gold and silver coins, because they knew that government officials could not print gold and silver coins. And it turned out to be the soundest monetary system in history, one that came to an end in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt. I'm not saying that's the ideal. My ideal would be what Friedrich Hayek says, a free market monetary system. Let the market decide the money. But I think it's the second best. And it was an acknowledgement of what's going on today. Their destruction of the monetary system to fund their ever-growing expenditures for the Pentagon, the CIA, all their foreign escapades, the welfare state recipients, the whole welfare warfare state concept.
I would just add to that, reinforcing that, is that the lessons that the free market and classical liberals of the 19th century learned were the episodes during the American Revolution and then France's wars, First Revolution in France and then Napoleon's wars. And that was the Continental Congress had created these continental notes to try to fund George Washington's war against the British, which caused huge inflation during the American Revolution. They even played with wage and price controls to fight it at the state levels. And
not
then,
worth the Continental.
Yes, not worth the Continental. And then during the long wars between France and various countries, particularly Great Britain, from the 1790s until 1815, Napoleon's fall after the Battle of Waterloo, they were experiencing these used paper money inflations. And what did the liberals, who were bringing about reforms in the post-war era, realize? That you cannot trust government to have its hand on the handle of the monetary printing press. And that, again, it was not a free market monetary system. It was a government established gold standard, but it was a rule that there could be no increase in the supply of money independent of an inflow of actual gold into the banking system. And if gold was withdrawn by depositors, foreign or domestic, the currency that was meant to be a claim to that gold had to be taken out of circulation. So the market supply of gold acted as the external check on the ability of a central bank or a government to abuse that handle of the printing press.
All right, on that note, we'll wrap it up. But Jim, I do want to ask you about one other thing. As you know, we have this embargo with Cuba, which prevents Americans from doing business with the Cubans. And I notice you're holding that cigar, and I'm really scared of the feds. And can you certify to us that this is not a Cuban cigar? Because that would really be a threat to national security if you happen to buy a Cuban cigar.
Well, freelance writers are not allowed to smoke Cuban cigars. And with the pay rate from FFF, I smoke cigars from the Dominican Republic. And these are actually ones that are very cheap. I found a place where I can get them for barely a buck a stick. So, I mean, the thought of buying expensive cigars, I mean, I have my vices, but I try to keep a price limit on them.
Yeah, I mean, reflecting the hypocrisy of U.S. officials, I recall the story of when John Kennedy was about to impose the embargo or a bigger embargo on Cuba. He says, go and order 1,000 cigars or something like that before I impose this embargo. And they did, brought this whole load of.
Yeah, and the thing that's funny is Kennedy did not realize at the time that was going to be a lifetime supply for him.
Nice. Okay, on that somber note, we'll wrap things up. Great to talk to you, Jim. Thanks for joining us.
Hey,
Richard, I enjoyed as always. Yeah, as always. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for tuning in. If you're new to FFF, subscribe to our FFF Daily. We consider it the best daily libertarian commentary page on the internet. Subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, in which both Jim and Richard write. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and buy my new book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. On that note, guys, thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Great.
Next time.